let's move then to the last presentation of this panel, focusing on gender and migration, by Professor Glenda Bonifacio, looking at gender migration in Leyte Islands, post-Haitian continuities and transformations. Glenda works a lot with women in post-disaster island situations, and that's where her research comes from. So Glenda, would be looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank the organizers, SICRI and the Center for Global Migration, University of Otago, for the opportunity to share my work. This is not really new to Pacific Islands, but perhaps because of, as well, my personal experience, I have expanded my research to disaster. So migration and disaster context. And it's nearly 8 in the evening in Alberta, Canada. And before I proceed and share with you my audio PowerPoint, I'd like to acknowledge that I am staying and living with the privileges of the traditional owners of the land in Southern Alberta, the Blackfoot Confederacy under Treaty 7 and Métis Nation Region 3. Let's see, I'll try to share my screen in the interest of time and my staying up late. I am Glenda Tibe Bonifacio from the University of Lethbridge. I am the current chair of the Department of Women and Gender Studies. In 2003, my family migrated to Canada from Australia, where I completed my PhD in political science at the School of History and Politics at the University of Wollongong, New South Wales. My research interest on gender and migration was grounded in my place as an international student 20 years ago. As a feminist scholar, I recognize my position as both an outsider and insider of the research process, since I am based in Canada with field work in the Philippines. In this presentation, I have outlined 5 discussion points. First, on the notion that geography as destiny in the historical and contemporary connections of Leyte Island. Second, the introspection of what is local and its relevance to the global in the context of climate change. Third, I share highlights of research findings on field work conducted between 2015 to 2018 in Leyte Island relative to post-Haiyan implications on gender, migration, and displacement. Fourth, I focus on the particular modalities of rural and urban migration post-disaster. And the 5th point of discussion refers to post-Yolanda reconstruction and transformations and the significance of equity and gender. The Asia-Pacific region is the most vulnerable to the impact of global climate change and located at the crossroads of pivotal historical and contemporary economic and political developments. Jean-Luc Gallup, Alejandro Gaviria, and Eduardo Lora published a book on Latin America entitled Is Geography Destiny?, which examines geographical factors, frequency of disasters, and presence of diseases and others. They argue that, quote, better understanding of geography, public policy, can help control its influence towards the goal of economic and social development, unquote. I pose the same question to the island of Leyte. Leyte Island is one of the 3 group of islands that comprise Eastern Visayas in the Philippines. The other 2 are the islands of Samar and Biliran. These are also island provinces by political divisions. As part of the 7,641 islands in the Philippine archipelago, also known as the 5th largest island country in the world, Leyte is connected to a unitary republican state where decentralization and devolution of local governance took effect only in the 1990s.
Leyte annually commemorates the liberation of the Philippines with the return of U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur in October 1944 during the Second World War in the Pacific. According to Lieutenant Commander Thomas Cutler, retired U.S. Navy, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, quote, was the biggest and most multifaceted naval battle in history, unquote. The Battle of the Leyte Gulf resulted in massive U.S. casualties of 16,043 soldiers and 7,272 soldiers killed, while Japan was noted to have suffered 419,912 deaths. In Daniel Boone Schimmer's article on the landing at Leyte after 50 years, Leyte is significant as a symbol of, quote, global victory over fascism, unquote. The recapture of the islands under Japanese control was, according to Jeremy Collins at the U.S. Naval World War II Museum, quote, one of the greatest symbolic and strategic victories of the Pacific War, unquote. In the same positioning of Leyte Island, the local experience of Yolanda connects with a global call amidst climate change. Philippines is one of the world's hotspots for natural hazards, with an average of 20 typhoons each year. 7 of 11 super typhoons or strongest landfalls in recorded history occurred in the Philippines. Haiyan is the strongest storm in history to hit landfall in the Philippines and, quote, one of the most powerful typhoons of all time, unquote. It was 3 times that of Hurricane Katrina, far stronger than Katrina and Sandy combined. Super Typhoon Haiyan registered 355 kilometers per hour, sustained winds, and qualified as Category 5 hurricane in terms of its winds and effects. Super Typhoon Haiyan impacted the Visayas Islands, particularly Eastern Visayas. Eastern Visayas is considered one of the typhoon-prone areas in the country. Haiyan extremely devastated Tacloban City, the capital of Leyte Province. I came from Tacloban City and lived half of my life before migrating to Australia and Canada. This topic is personal to me, and as the feminist slogan claims, the personal is political. Haiyan destroyed 90% of Tacloban City. It literally flattened the city. This is the concrete house of my sister-in-law, who perished from the storm surge after saving her children to safety. Friends and families commemorate November 8 as the saddest day, or, quote, the day when God was asleep, unquote. The local tragedy was tied to the global rhythms. As a scholar, this was a turning point in the direction of my research program, becoming what you call an accidental sociologist of disaster. Somehow, the weaving of our lives in Canada and elsewhere cannot be separated from the islands. I continually argue that the local reflects the interconnections of diverse factors that shape realities. These realities are played out in quotidian lives, in the constructs and structures of inequalities and vulnerabilities. According to Simon Veron, Maud Mouchet, Raphael Roberts, Thomas Haberman, and Rosalie Pellens, in the island code systems are among the most vulnerable to climate change, which is predicted to include shifts in temperature, rainfall, and/or sea levels, unquote. But the most important component is the impact on human lives. Those who survive tells a story and ground our advocacy for better protection. Super Typhoon Haiyan affected 16 million people, and etched in the local imaginary the death of over 6,000 people and displacement of 4.1 million people in the Visayas Islands. After the 13th storm surge in Tacloban City, houses were destroyed and survivors left en masse to other islands. The city was desolate with abandoned houses in disarray, even in 2015 when I conducted a summer field course. Leyte, after the devastation of Haiyan, witnessed migration as a norm among households in order to survive. First, migration was motivated by the support coming from relatives in other islands. Second, survivors were attracted to areas with presence of support from local governments. Third, access to resources and transportation defined resettlement. Data from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Service since 2008 indicated that displacement caused by natural hazards and climate change are 3 times more than those displaced by war and conflict. Because displacement occurs internal to affected countries, social protection is dependent on national resources and international humanitarian assistance. People who migrated internally due to extreme weather rose to 31 million in the world in 2020. Migration is a gendered process with differential outcomes and experiences for women, men, girls, boys, and gender diverse individuals. According to Sri Lakshmi Guru Raja, there are, quote, dramatic increase in the number of women as heads of households, bear additional responsibilities for children and aging relatives, unquote, due to displacement. The case of Leyte as the epicenter of Super Typhoon Haiyan reminds us of our fragile existence under the epoch of the Anthropocene. According to UNFPA in 2021, 80% of disaster-related displacements globally occur in the Asia Pacific. Post-disaster Haiyan in the island of Leyte resulted in forced displacement to other islands in the Philippines, where connections are established or at the behest of social welfare agencies. There are no statistics or records of how many left after Haiyan and returned after a few months or years. Anecdotal evidence suggests that those with income support permanently migrated and started anew, selling dilapidated properties behind. Many returned to pick up the pieces. Circular migration attested movement from the rural to the urban within the confines of the island. Many found jobs in the reconstruction and rehabilitation. Vulnerable women and girls fall prey to human trafficking, bound to metropolitan centers or for domestic or sex work. The usual pattern of mobility among households in rural areas seemingly increased with women and girls taking the lead to earn additional income. In other words, an intersectional modalities of gender-defined migration, together with the income level, education, skills, and destination, contributed to different migration experiences. The rural landscape has changed in the last few decades, brought about by international migration among members of rural households. Concrete houses located in vast rice fields, for example. The rural economy, while impacted heavily post-disaster, was supported by overseas remittances. Infusion of cash for work program by international humanitarian groups like Chuchi Foundation enabled survivors to work locally. One of the highlights of my field work was the phenomenon of child migration post-Haiyan. This is an important area to examine further as to whether they migrated and how, as to where they migrated. Were more girls left or more boys left post-disaster? Another consideration is the extended kinship network among Filipinos that could facilitate such migration inflows of children, or something else. Based on observational summer field course with my students in 2015 and research field work in 2017-2018, I highlight the key findings of post-Yolanda reconstruction and transformation. EVRMC, or the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Center, was washed out during Haiyan, formerly located near Magsaysay Boulevard, close to the downtown core in Tacloban City. Now, a huge complex of buildings outside of the city was constructed to serve the public as a government hospital. Resettlement or relocation of displaced families was also outside of the city. So much could be said about the implications of reconstruction in the lives of women and men in the continuing reconstruction of city post-Haiyan. Structural rezoning affected traditional sources of income for women and men. Others claim that reconstruction post-Haiyan brought a new city outlook, much cleaner and welcoming. On the other, it also brought to light the continued marginalization of vulnerable people, poor women particularly. As more women are heads of households, or increasing number of single mothers, the distance to commute to the center for their main source of livelihood is challenging. The city has designated routes that each transit points going to the destination yield higher fares. Ultimately, a number has observably returned to residences pre-Haiyan. Transformations in island communities are impactful. They occur naked to the eye because of limited space. In general, the fieldwork revealed 4 aspects of transformations in Leyte Island. These are not mainly due to Super Typhoon Haiyan, but have been ongoing for some time. Perhaps what Haiyan did was to hasten the process with international assistance. First, physical and structural, reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure and construction of new ones. Rezoning of areas and classification of danger zones near the shores, road widening are just examples. Second, rapid urbanization with housing developments and resettlement areas. Increase of private vehicles as securing mobility and reminder of the difficulty of getting transportation after Haiyan. Third, what I call the social environmental nexus, at which point the transformation is critical. While rapid urbanization and desire to live in the city for education and livelihood are the main drivers, the state of the environment remains problematic. Trees cut down to pave for more roads, mountains flattened, or rivers scraped for gravel are just some disturbing phenomena. Of late, however, communities are being empowered by disregard of the environment and lack of government enforcement. Fourth, gender mainstreaming has been a program under the Republic Act number 9710, or the Magna Carta of Women. Local resources are insufficient to provide social protection for the marginalized sector. The Philippine Disaster Reduction and Management Act, or RA 10121, provides a comprehensive and integrated community approach to disaster risk management, and gender is a key area. The span of rural to urban resources to ensure gender sensitivity in disaster mitigation are not yet realized. The popular response of research participants is, gender does not matter. Each can be equal. Perhaps another research topic to pursue. I end this presentation with my own quote. Disasters come our way, but the unforgettable lesson is to heed their call. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda.
I'm ready for your questions.
It was really striking what you said, that 80% of disaster-related displacements occur in the Asia-Pacific region. And a region
Yes.
has such high number of islands.
Yes. The Philippines is one of the, I think, the first or the second most at-risk country in the world. And that is starking to me, and why I study migration and disaster, like Australia, Canada, and internally in various areas. I haven't really, like, without like Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda. International name was Haiyan and local name is Yolanda. It kind of shook me, like, as a scholar, in the way that I do study migration, when they do enter countries, but not necessarily understanding that those movements are actually connected to the environment. They're actually connected to the typhoon experiences in different islands, and they actually move and migrate. So, and then going through this research, very recently, the last, since that typhoon Haiyan, it kind of, like, I'm living in Canada, and to push, the consciousness, the critical consciousness of the connections between the West, countries in Canada, USA, and whatnot, the West countries, and how our lives and what we do in the West contribute to what's happening, in island countries, in my country. And that has become my, my sort of my, I think, in the last few years that I'm going to be a professor, to be a way to, to put all this stuff together and provide that medium, in the West about our lives, that, so it's kind of, yeah. And that's why it's really struck me, and particularly that displacement is 3 times more than those reported for war and conflict. And here in Canada, you always hear, conflict in Syria, in the Middle East, but rarely do they actually report, the connection between what's going on in different countries displaced, or people displaced by disaster or environmental change. And they simply look into when people leave the country. And I think a classic example are people coming from Haiti, and then being stopped and treated badly by, US border guards and whatnot. So really, it's something that has, for me, yeah, it's more than a research for me. It's kind of like sort of a mission in my last whatever.
Yeah, and it's personal, and I'm sorry for your loss. I mean, what yeah.
I actually, I also lost my brother. So, when Haiyan happened, I was, of course, I was in Canada. I had no contact with my family for about a week, because no cell phone, nothing, no communication, everything down. So you don't know what happened to your family for a week. And then I just see people, social media, on Facebook saying that, your X and X and X, I saw them there, whatever. And then after a week, I found my family in different areas. So, and anyway, after a week, there was sort of them being connected. And then we had to try and help them, sort of, because they were displaced, relocated to another island, so they could actually receive, the money or remittances, because Tacloban was down, so for them to migrate to another island would be the first response. So it kind of, after that experience, it came to me that displacement in all of this is more than responding, but could be a way to look into. After that, response and displacement, my brother also died when they have to return back, and the island's way of cleaning was to burn. So the city was burning for a year, and my brother has asthma, and it has exacerbated, the environment. So eventually, he died after 9 months. So
the post-disaster related deaths that we don't often account in the immediate disaster and the aftermath of the disaster. So it's a heavy mantle to wear there, Glenda, in your mission to not only, research the impact, but also become an advocate, to the rest of for us to know.
Yeah, and maybe an opportunity for me to share with you that the Canadian Commission for UNESCO has endorsed my proposal to establish the chair on gender, migration, and post-disaster communities in the Asia-Pacific region. So in that sense, I'm going to build, that kind of bridge between what's happening in the Pacific Islands and what's happening to us there into a more mainstream way that encourages students, in Canada and other countries to actually have a more dialogue and conversation with students and scholars and practitioners in the Asia-Pacific region, or island countries like, Tonga, like you. So it's not only you, talking about what's going on, but also connecting with us, because the only way that we could actually increase critical consciousness about gender lives, about migration, displacement, is for us to actually come together in a sort of a dialogue, not only within us, but also for the next generation of scholars like Agnieszka, like students. So because I have some freedom to choose what I teach, I teach the gender, migration, gender and disaster seminar course. I include, environment and disaster, whatever, in all my courses, even introduction to women's studies, even my research class, everything has a connection with the local and the global to the environment. Because Canada, after COP 2026 and whatnot, here there's so much about environment and what we do. And I said, really, you're talking about something that's not happening to you, really. Just now you have flash flood and what this, but building them into the realization that while you talk about climate change, there are people already suffering from the impact of our inaction and our inability to actually understand, how their lives are shaped by our own actions here in the West. So yeah, anyway, thank you.
Congratulations for the UNESCO chair. I know that you have been working on this for some time now, so this is great news. I'm really thrilled for you. And hearing your presentation now, I know a little bit more what fueled that passion what has been driving you to do this. Are there any comments or perhaps questions, Daisy?
Thank you, Vali. Thank you, Glenda, for that wonderful presentation. And I also, similar to Marianne's comments to Malika, it's our sympathy for your loss in the process and what's actually fueled the passion to make things happen. But I just wanted to make a comment in terms of how much we have in common, like in the Philippines as well as in the islands in the Pacific. These are issues that we constantly and have faced for many years, long before recognition was actually made and acknowledged by the bigger or so-called superpowers. And I feel that we need more people like you to actually push and advocate to ensure that that there's voice or voices added for our peoples And I say this with peoples as in plural, because we're quite diverse. We can't be, homogenized into one group, which has been another fight of its own. But I do want to acknowledge your wonderful and in-depth insights provided and shared with us today, Whaftai.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have hope with my students. My students here, of course, most of them are white. They're Canadians in a way. And I'm very hopeful for my students, the young generation of students, who believe, that, I teach also the activism and advocacy and the environment, the social justice is there. And how my students are trying to reach out, saying that, what can I do to make a difference? How could I make it right? Like, how could I make something that would actually produce a lasting change, or not only a white savior in that context, but rather something that, so it's really more education, like connecting, like, for example, under this UNESCO idea is that, it's trying to connect with scholars like you, not necessarily that, a source of extracted knowledge, but rather you're part, of the process. We co-create the knowledge. You also become the source of the knowledge, in the global north. So including, your scholarship, your expertise to be validated and used in Canada is something important to me. I read so many of those assignments or materials written by Western authors, Western scholars of the South. So it's something like an outsider perspective, rather than, maybe using the works of Yuki Kihara, like works from the South to be part, of our learning in the West. And that's something it's important to me, like providing that equity in terms of knowledge production, and who has more validity, or what they say, to affirm the validity of the knowledge coming from you, coming from us. Yeah. So I think I talk a lot.
Oh, thank you, Glenda. You're here. You're speaking your presentation. I know we could keep talking about this as all the other presentations, but we need to move into the last session of today's symposium. For those of you who are interested in Glenda's work, if you go into the SICRI website, there is a separate page that is devoted entirely on Glenda's network. And if you want to join, please do. I think Glenda would be delighted to have more people.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for Valia. Valia is an amazing colleague, collaborator in many aspects. And thanks to Valia, I actually found my home in island studies. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to connect with you, and perhaps maybe also because in the West, there's sort of the gatekeepers for graduate studies. So I offered to be a supervisor for graduate students for a master's and a PhD coming from Asia Pacific island countries. So without the supervisor, a student cannot enroll, and then I offer that slot to anybody who would be interested to work on gender, migration, and disaster.
So if you know anyone, go to Glenda. She will be the most amazing supervisor on this subject matter. Thank you for sharing the resources and all that and the knowledge.